Did you know Canada had the fourth largest Allied military by the end of the Second World War? For a country with just 11 million people at the time, that is a staggering fact. We often hear about Canada's role on D-Day at Juno Beach. It's a story of incredible bravery. But, that's just one story. The full picture is so much bigger, so much more complex, and in many ways, so much more surprising. What if the war in the air was won, in part, because of the wide open skies of the Canadian prairies? What if a Canadian-made invention saved countless fighter pilots from blacking out in dogfights? What if a top-secret spy school on the shores of Lake Ontario trained the agents who would later form the CIA? Canada wasn't just a junior partner in the fight. It was a laboratory, a factory, a farm, a bank, and a training ground for the entire Allied world. Its contributions were woven into the fabric of the war effort, often in quiet, unassuming ways that have been forgotten by history. From the uranium dug out of the northern earth that would change the world forever, to the women who built the warplanes, the story is one of innovation, sacrifice, and quiet determination. How did this small northern nation manage to punch so far above its weight? Like, what hidden stories are still waiting to be told? Number 21 was a Canadian, the real-life James Bond. It seems like something out of a movie. A quiet, unassuming Canadian businessman becomes the linchpin of Allied intelligence, a spymaster who operates in the shadows and earns the trust of both Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt. But it is not fiction. His name was Sir William Stephenson, and his story is more incredible than any spy novel. Born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Stephenson was a decorated pilot in the First World War. After the war, he became a wealthy industrialist, a millionaire with a talent for invention, and a network of business contacts that spanned the globe. He saw the growing threat in Europe long before many politicians did. Using his own money and contacts, he began gathering intelligence on German industrial and military buildup in the 1930s. He passed this information to Winston Churchill, who was then out of power but deeply concerned about the future. When war broke out, Churchill knew exactly who to turn to. He put Stephenson in charge of a new organization, the British Security Coordination (BSC), headquartered in New York City. This was a deliberately boring name for an organization with a breathtakingly dangerous mission. Its job was to run all British intelligence operations in the Western Hemisphere. From an office in Rockefeller Center, Stephenson oversaw a vast network of espionage, counter-espionage, propaganda, and covert operations. He was given the codename Intrepid. His influence was immense. He was a close confidant of President Roosevelt and helped convince a skeptical, isolationist America to support the Allied cause. He worked closely with William J. Wild Bill Donovan to establish the American Intelligence Agency, the Office of Strategic Services OSS, which would later become the CIA. In fact, many of the first OSS agents were trained by Stephenson's people. His organization exposed enemy spy rings in North and South America, disrupted supply lines, and created black propaganda, false information designed to demoralize the enemy. He was instrumental in cracking enemy codes and passing that vital information, known as ultra-intelligence, directly to the highest levels of the Allied command. The book A Man Called Intrepid by William Stephenson, no relation, brought his story to a wider audience in the 1970s, though some historians argue it exaggerates certain details. However, there is no denying Stephenson's central role. He was the quiet Canadian who connected the intelligence worlds of Britain and America, a master of the secret war whose work saved countless lives and shortened the conflict. Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, worked for British naval intelligence during the war and knew Stephenson. He later said, "James Bond is a highly romanticized version of a true spy. The real thing is William Stephenson." But how much of Stephenson's work remains classified to this day? What covert operations did he run that were so sensitive they were never committed to paper? And how did a single individual manage to wield so much influence over the leaders of the free world, all from a single office in New York? Number 20, how did a farm in Ontario become the world's most secret school? Just a short drive from Toronto, near the town of Whitby, there was a farm. To anyone passing by, it looked ordinary. But behind its fences, one of the most secret and dangerous operations of the war was underway. This was Camp X, officially known as Special Training School Number 103. It was a finishing school for spies. Opened in December 1941, Camp X was a joint British, Canadian, and American operation established under the direction of William Stephenson, Intrepid. Its purpose was to train covert agents in the arts of sabotage, espionage, and silent killing. Here, men and women learned how to derail trains, blow up bridges, forge documents, pick locks, and kill with their bare hands. And they learned to send and receive coded messages through a sophisticated radio station called Hydra, which became a primary communication link for Allied intelligence between North America and Europe. The instructors were masters of their craft, drawn from the British Special Operations Executive SOE, often called Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. They taught skills that had no place in a civilized world but were essential to winning a war. The curriculum was brutal and practical. The trainees learned to make explosives from common household items and to use a simple knife or piece of wire as a deadly weapon. They practiced infiltration and exfiltration under the cover of darkness. The stakes were absolute. A single mistake in the field would mean capture, torture, and death. Over 500 Allied agents graduated from Camp X. They were dropped behind enemy lines in Europe and Asia, where they worked with resistance movements, gathered intelligence, and wreaked havoc on the enemy's war machine. The very existence of the camp was a closely guarded secret. Locals were told it was a police training facility or a radio communication school. The truth was far more complex. It was here that British experience in clandestine warfare was transferred to the Americans of the newly formed OSS. Camp X was a crucible where the foundations of modern North American intelligence agencies were forged. Lynn Philip Hodgson, in his book Inside Camp X, has meticulously documented the camp's history, preserving the stories of the people who trained and worked there. The camp was so secret that after the war, all the buildings were torn down and the records were either destroyed or locked away. It was as if it never existed. All that remains today is a small monument in a public park, a quiet tribute to the extraordinary activities that once took place on that soil. But what really happened to the graduates of Camp X? How many of them survived their perilous missions, and how many simply disappeared into the fog of war? What secret techniques were invented on that Ontario farm that are still in use by intelligence agencies today? And how many of its stories were deliberately buried forever? Number 19. Could a single woman build a fighter plane? The image is iconic. A young woman in overalls, her hair tied up in a scarf, works intently on a piece of machinery. She was the Canadian Rosie the Riveter, a symbol of the millions of women who stepped out of their traditional roles and into the factories, shipyards, and farms to power the war effort. One of the most famous of these images was of Veronica Foster, who became known as the Bren Gun Girl from a series of popular propaganda posters. She worked at the John Ingalls Coal plant in Toronto, which produced thousands of Bren light machine guns. But this was not just a propaganda campaign, it was a reality. With over 1 million Canadian men in uniform, the country faced a massive labor shortage. The solution was to turn to women. At the beginning of the war, about 600,000 Canadian women had jobs. By its peak, that number had doubled to 1.2 million. They did work that was previously considered men's work. They built tanks, assembled artillery shells, welded ships, and manufactured aircraft. In aircraft factories like Canadian Car and Foundry in Fort William, now Thunder Bay, women made up over a third of the workforce building Hawker Hurricane fighter planes. Elsie McGill was a trailblazer. As the chief aeronautical engineer at Canadian Car and Foundry, she oversaw the production of over 1,400 Hurricanes. She was the first woman in the world to earn a master's degree in aeronautical engineering and was known as the Queen of the Hurricanes. She redesigned the planes for winter flying, adding skis and de-icing equipment, a crucial adaptation for both training and for planes being sent to the Eastern Front. Her leadership proved that women could not only work in but also lead in highly technical and demanding fields. The impact was profound. Women working in munitions plants handled dangerous explosives daily. They faced long hours, unequal pay, and the challenge of balancing factory work with running a household. Yet, their contribution was absolutely essential. Without them, Canada's industrial output would have collapsed. They produced over 16,000 aircraft, 800,000 military vehicles, and 50,000 tanks and armored personnel carriers. This industrial army on the home front was as vital to victory as the army fighting overseas. Their work is detailed in historical accounts like the Home Front by the Canadian War Museum, which highlights the social and economic shifts of the era. For the war, most women were encouraged, and in many cases forced, to leave their jobs and return to the home. But a fundamental change had occurred. A generation of women had experienced economic independence and had proven their capabilities in every field. The seeds of the post-war women's rights movement were sown in the noisy, bustling factories of wartime Canada. But how many women suffered long-term health effects from working with toxic materials in those unregulated factories? What was the true social cost for the families and children left behind as mothers worked grueling shifts? And did the brief taste of economic freedom permanently alter the expectations of an entire generation of Canadian women in ways we are still understanding? Number 18. Did Canadians fight a secret war on their own river? When we think of the war at sea, we imagine the vast cold expanse of the North Atlantic. We think of convoys battling U-boats far from shore. But what if the enemy was not just in the deep ocean, but right inside Canada's own front door? The Battle of the St. Lawrence was a little-known but terrifying chapter of the war, a time when enemy submarines hunted and sank ships in the very heart of the country. Between 1942 and 1944, German U-boats penetrated the Gulf of St. Lawrence and even sailed up the St. Lawrence River itself, reaching as far as the town of Rimouski, Quebec. This was one of the most protected and vital waterways in the world, the main artery for shipping convoys forming in Montreal and Quebec City before they headed out to the Atlantic. The presence of U-boats so deep within Canadian territory was a huge shock to the military and a terrifying reality for the coastal communities. The attacks were swift and deadly. In May 1942, a U-boat sank 2 freighters in the river overnight. In September, another U-boat torpedoed and sank the naval escort HMCS Raccoon. The most tragic incident occurred on October 14, 1942, when the ferry SS Caribou was torpedoed in the Cabot Strait on its run between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. 137 people, including women and children, lost their lives. The war had come home in the most brutal way imaginable. The Royal Canadian Navy was stretched to its absolute limit. They were already struggling to protect the convoys in the Atlantic. Now, they had to fight a second naval war in their own inland waters. They implemented a convoy system within the Gulf, blacked out coastal towns, and increased air patrols. But the U-boats were elusive, masters of stealth who used the river's deep channels and murky waters to their advantage. Historian Michael L. Hadley explores this tense campaign in his book, U-Boats Against Canada. He documents how, for a period, the Canadian government effectively closed the St. Lawrence to overseas shipping, a stunning admission of their inability to guarantee safety. In total, over 20 ships, including 4 Canadian warships, were sunk in the St. Lawrence campaign. This hidden battle had a huge psychological impact. It brought the fear and reality of the war to the doorsteps of Quebec and the Atlantic provinces. It was a stark reminder that no part of Canada was truly safe. The fight in the St. Lawrence forced the Canadian military to rapidly improve its anti-submarine warfare techniques, lessons that would be applied in the wider Battle of the Atlantic. It remains a chilling episode, a secret war fought in familiar waters. But how close did a U-boat ever get to the major ports of Quebec City or Montreal? Were there secret U-boat refueling stations hidden along the isolated coasts of Labrador or Quebec, as some local legends claim? And how much did the Canadian government censor the news of these attacks to prevent widespread panic? Number 17 was the deadliest weapon of the war, partially a Canadian secret. It was called the proximity fuze. To the public, it was just another piece of military hardware. But to scientists and military leaders, it was one of the most important technological developments of the war, ranked by some as second only to the atomic bomb in its impact. And Canada played a crucial, often overlooked, role in its creation and perfection. A standard artillery or anti-aircraft shell worked on a timer or on direct impact. This was incredibly inefficient. You had to get a direct hit or have the shell explode at the exact right altitude to be effective, which was almost impossible against a fast-moving aircraft. The proximity fuse solved this problem with a stroke of genius. It was a tiny, rugged radio transmitter and receiver placed in the nose of a shell. The fuse would emit radio waves, and when the shell got close enough to a target, like an airplane or the ground, the reflected waves would trigger the detonator. The shell didn't need to hit the target, it just had to get close. This increased the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire by a factor of at least 3. The basic concept was developed by British scientists, but they lacked the industrial capacity to mass produce it. The project was shared with the Americans under the Tizard mission in 1940, a secret exchange of technology. The Americans took the lead in development and manufacturing. So where does Canada fit in? The National Research Council of Canada, NRC, in Ottawa became a key partner. Canadian scientists working with their British and American counterparts helped solve some of the most difficult technical challenges. The main problem was creating a miniature radio tube that could withstand the incredible shock of being fired from a cannon over 20,000 times, the force of gravity, and then start working perfectly in a fraction of a second. According to historical records from the NRC, Canadian physicists and engineers made significant contributions to the fuse's rugged design and reliable circuitry. Canada also established its own production facility, Research Enterprises Limited in Leaside, Toronto, which manufactured thousands of the complex devices and the critical electronic components for them. The fuse was a top-secret weapon for most of the war. It was first used by the Navy in the Pacific in 1943, where it devastated enemy air attacks. It was later introduced in Europe to shoot down V-1 flying bombs aimed at Britain, saving London from untold destruction. Finally, during the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944, it was used in land-based artillery, creating lethal airbursts over enemy troops. The effect was both physically and psychologically devastating. The enemy had no idea how Allied artillery had suddenly become so deadly. It was a war-winning piece of technology, and Canada's quiet expert contribution was essential to its success. But how many specific Canadian scientific breakthroughs within the NRC were directly incorporated into the final fuse design? Were there rival fuse designs developed in Canada that were ultimately shelved? And what happened to the vast pool of Canadian technical expertise in electronics that was created by this project after the war ended? Number 16, what if a forgotten army of farmers fed Britain? Soldiers march on their stomachs. It is an old saying, but it was never truer than during the Second World War. Britain, an island nation, was dangerously dependent on imported food. Enemy U-boats in the Atlantic aimed to starve the country into submission by sinking the merchant ships that were its lifeline. The battle for food was just as critical as any battle fought with guns, and it was a battle that Canadian farmers helped win. Before the war, Canada was already a major supplier of wheat to the world, but the war created an insatiable demand for more. More wheat, more flour, and especially more high-protein foods like pork and cheese. The Canadian government, under the leadership of Agriculture Minister James Gardiner, mobilized the nation's farms. They signed massive agreements with the British Ministry of Food, promising to deliver huge quantities of essential supplies. The most famous of these efforts was the Bacon for Britain program. Canadian farmers were asked to dramatically increase their hog production. They responded in a huge way. Before the war, Canada shipped about 1.6 million pounds of bacon and pork products to Britain annually. By 1943, that number had skyrocketed to over 690 million pounds. It was a staggering increase. This bacon was a vital source of protein for British civilians and soldiers living on strict rations. Similarly, cheese production was ramped up, with entire factories dedicated to producing Canadian cheddar for the British market. Shipments of eggs in powdered form to save space were also sent in vast quantities. This agricultural army was made up of families on farms across the prairies, in Ontario and in Quebec. They faced shortages of labor as young men enlisted in the military. They dealt with shortages of fuel and machinery, yet they met and exceeded the production targets year after year. The government helped by promoting programs like the Dominion Provincial Youth Training Program to train young people for farm work, where women's institutes and other community groups organized to preserve food and support the farm effort. This incredible story of agricultural mobilization is detailed in books like Harvests of War by historian Ian Mosby, who also uncovered the uncomfortable fact that while Canada was feeding Britain, it was also conducting nutritional experiments on its own indigenous populations, a dark side to the home front story. The convoys that carried this food were prime targets for U-boats. Many sailors and tons of precious cargo were lost to the bottom of the Atlantic. But enough got through. Canada's food shipments were a critical pillar of the Allied war effort. They kept Britain from starving, maintained morale, and fueled the workers in the factories and the soldiers on the front lines. It was contribution made not with bombs and bullets, but with tractors and hard work. But how did the wartime pressure to produce change the Canadian landscape and the nature of farming forever, pushing it towards industrial agriculture? What was the real nutritional impact on Canadians at home, who were also facing rationing to make these shipments possible? And how did the complex logistics of moving this mountain of food from a farm in Saskatchewan to a dinner table in London actually work? Number 15. Did Canadians fight one of the war's toughest battles in Italy? The campaign in Italy is often called the Forgotten Front. After the Allied victory in North Africa in 1943, the next logical step was to invade Sicily and then mainland Italy, what Winston Churchill famously called the soft underbelly of Europe. it turned out to be anything but soft. It was a brutal, bloody, slogging match up the mountainous Italian peninsula. And Canadian soldiers were in the thick of it from the very beginning. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division and the 1st Canadian Armored Brigade landed in Sicily in July 1943 as part of the British 8th Army. They fought with distinction in the 38-day campaign to capture the island, battling not only a determined enemy but also scorching heat, malaria, and rugged terrain. After Sicily was secured, they moved on to the Italian mainland in September. The fighting that followed was some of the most difficult of the entire war. The German forces in Italy were experts in defensive warfare. They used the country's mountains, rivers, and ancient stone towns to create a series of formidable defensive lines. The Canadians, now part of the Canadian Corps, had to fight for every river crossing, every mountain ridge, and every village. The most infamous of these battles was the fight for the town of Ortona in December 1943. Ortona was a medieval town on the Adriatic coast with narrow, winding streets and thick, walled stone buildings. The enemy turned it into a fortress. The battle for Ortona became a vicious, street-by-street, house-by-house struggle. Canadian troops from the Loyal Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada had to use a technique they called mouse-holing, blasting holes through the walls of adjoining houses to advance, avoiding the heavily booby-trapped streets. It was brutal, close-quarters combat against elite enemy paratroopers. For over a week, the battle raged. The town was reduced to rubble. The Canadians eventually captured what was left of Ortona, but at a terrible cost. The battle was so intense it was nicknamed Little Stalingrad. The Italian campaign continued for another year and a half for the Canadians. They fought in major battles like the breaking of the Hitler Line and the Gothic Line. The cost was immense. Of the nearly 93,000 Canadians who served in Italy, over 26,000 became casualties, with nearly 6,000 killed. They were often referred to, sometimes bitterly, as the D-Day Dodgers, because they were not part of the more famous invasion of Normandy. But their sacrifice was crucial. Their campaign tied down dozens of elite enemy divisions that could have otherwise been used to fight in France or on the Eastern Front. Farley Mowat's searing memoir, And No Bird Sang, provides a visceral, first-hand account of the horror and futility of the fighting in Italy. But did the strategic decision to invade Italy truly shorten the war, or did it just create a costly and brutal stalemate? How did the experience of the vicious street fighting in Ortona influence the tactics Canadian troops later used in Northwest Europe? And why has the incredible sacrifice of the Canadians in the Italian campaign been so overshadowed in popular memory by the battles in Normandy? Number 14, how did a wooden plane built in a furniture factory become a legend? It was called the Wooden Wonder. It was a plane so fast and so versatile that the enemy's Air Force chief, Hermann Göring, publicly fumed about it. It was the de Havilland Mosquito, one of the most remarkable aircraft of the Second World War, and many of them were built in Canada. The Mosquito was a British design, and it was revolutionary. At a time when fighter planes and bombers were becoming all metal, the Mosquito was built primarily of wood, plywood, spruce, and balsa, held together with special glues. This had several advantages. It conserved precious metals like aluminum, which were in short supply. It also meant that the plane could be built by workers with experience in woodworking, like cabinet makers and piano builders. The wooden construction, combined with its two powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same engines used in the Spitfire, made the Mosquito incredibly light and astonishingly fast. For much of the war, it was the fastest operational aircraft in the world, able to outrun most enemy fighters. The de Havilland Aircraft of Canada Company, based in Downsview near Toronto, was chosen to be a major producer of the Mosquito. The Canadian production line faced numerous challenges. They had to source the right kind of wood from British Columbia, deal with different glues and fabrication techniques, and adapt the design for North American production standards. The first Canadian-built Mosquito flew in September 1942. By the end of the war, the Downsview plant had produced over 1,100 of them. The Canadian-built Mosquitoes served in every theater of the war. They were used as fast, high-altitude bombers that could hit targets in Germany with near impunity. They were used as night fighters, equipped with early forms of radar to hunt down enemy bombers over Britain. They were used as photo reconnaissance aircraft, flying deep into enemy territory, relying on sheer speed to escape. And they were used in daring, low-level precision strikes like the famous raid on Amiens prison in 1944, which aimed to free French resistance fighters. The story of its production and operational use is well documented in books like Mosquito, the Original Multi-Role Combat Aircraft by Graham M. Simons. The Canadian contribution to the Mosquito program was more than just manufacturing, it was a testament to Canadian industrial ingenuity and adaptability. The workers at the Downsview plant, many of whom were women, took a radical design and turned it into a war-winning weapon. The Wooden Wonder proved that innovation could come from unexpected materials, and that Canadian industry could produce some of the most advanced military technology in the world. But were there secret variants of the Mosquito designed or modified in Canada that we still don't know about? How did Canadian engineers solve the specific problems of wood delamination and warping in the harsh climates where the Mosquito operated? And what lasting impact did the advanced woodworking and lamination techniques developed for the Mosquito have on other Canadian industries after the war? Number 13, could a tank designed in Canada have changed the war? In the early years of the war, the Allies were desperate for tanks. The German Blitzkrieg had shown the devastating power of modern armored warfare, and Britain's tank production could not keep up with the demand, especially after losing so much equipment at Dunkirk. Canada, with its burgeoning automotive industry, was tasked with a monumental challenge design and build its own tank. The result was the Ram. The Ram was developed in 1941 at the Montreal Locomotive Works. It was based on the chassis of the American M3 Lee tank, but with a significantly better design. The M3 had its main gun mounted on the side of the hull, which limited its field of fire. The Canadian designers of the Ram created a new cast steel upper hull and a fully traversing turret that could house the main gun, a British-designed 6-pounder cannon. In many ways, the Ram was superior to its contemporary, the American M4 Sherman, which was still in development. It had a lower profile, thicker armor, and a more robust construction. Nearly 2,000 Ram tanks were built in Canada between 1941 and 1943. They were shipped to Britain to equip the newly forming Canadian and Allied armored divisions that were training for the eventual invasion of Europe. The tank crews trained extensively on the Rams. They were reliable, tough, and well liked by the men who operated them. So, why have so few people heard of the Ram tank? Why did it never see combat in its primary role? The answer lies in standardization. By the time the Canadian divisions were ready for combat in Northwest Europe, the American M4 Sherman had become the standard main battle tank for almost all Allied armies. It was being produced in enormous numbers, and for logistical reasons, spare parts, ammunition, training, it made sense for everyone to use the same equipment. The decision was made to re-equip the Canadian armored divisions with Shermans. The Ram, a superior tank in some respects, was relegated to a training role. However, that is not the end of the story. The rugged and reliable Ram chassis was too good to waste. It was converted into a variety of other essential military vehicles. Many were turned into Kangaroos, the world's first armored personnel carriers, by removing the turret. These vehicles could carry infantry safely into battle, protected from shrapnel and small arms fire. Others were converted into armored command vehicles, artillery observation posts, and Sexton self-propelled guns, which became the standard artillery piece for British and Canadian forces. So while the Ram never fired its main gun in anger as a battle tank, its chassis saw extensive and vital service all the way to the end of the war. The story of the Ram is a classic Canadian tale, a story of excellent engineering and industrial might, ultimately overshadowed by the larger strategic needs of the Alliance, as detailed in publications from the Canadian War Museum. But what if the Ram had been adopted as the main battle tank for the Commonwealth armies? Could its superior design have made a significant difference in the tough tank battles of Normandy? How did the political decisions between Ottawa, London, and Washington ultimately seal the Ram's fate? And are there forgotten blueprints in the archives for an even more advanced Ram 2 that was never built? Number 12. Why was the world's largest air force based in rural Canada? At the outset of the war, the British Commonwealth faced a critical problem. It needed tens of thousands of trained pilots, navigators, bomb-emmers, and air gunners, and it needed them fast. But Britain was too small, too crowded, and too close to the enemy for large-scale flight training. The solution was a plan of breathtaking ambition and scale, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan BCAP. And Canada was chosen to be its main home. Prime Minister Mackenzie King called it Canada's most important contribution to the war. It was an understatement. The BCAP was a massive undertaking that turned Canada into a gigantic air training school for the Allied world. The vast open skies of the prairies, the distance from the battlefields of Europe, and Canada's industrial capacity made it the ideal location. The plan was signed in December 1939, and it transformed the country. Airfields, hangars, and barracks sprang up in small towns and rural areas from coast to coast. In total, the plan operated 107 schools and 184 ancillary units across the country. Towns like Claresholm, Alberta, or Souris, Manitoba, suddenly found themselves hosting thousands of young men from Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and other allied nations alongside the Canadian trainees. It created a huge construction boom and thousands of civilian jobs for instructors, mechanics, and support staff. The scale of the operation is hard to comprehend. By the end of the war, the BCAT had produced 131,553 trained aircrew. That is an astonishing number. Nearly half of all the aircrew who fought for the British Commonwealth during the war got their wings in Canada. They learned to fly in iconic trainers like the de Havilland Tiger Moth and the North American Harvard. They learned to navigate by the stars over the vast empty plains and to drop practice bombs on targets in the middle of nowhere. The cost was immense, over $2.2 billion at the time, with Canada paying the majority of it. The human cost was also high, over 850 trainees and instructors were killed in training accidents. The BCAP was a model of international cooperation. It was a complex organization that required coordinating the efforts of multiple governments, air forces, and civilian contractors. As documented by historians like F.J. Hatch in Aerodrome of Democracy, the plan was a resounding success. It provided the constant stream of skilled airmen needed to fight and win the air war in Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. It was, in the words of President Roosevelt, the Aerodrome of Democracy. It was an industrial-scale training program that was, in its own way, as important as any factory or shipyard. But what was the long-term social impact on the small Canadian towns that were suddenly thrust onto the international stage? How did the experience of living and training in Canada change the perspectives of the tens of thousands of young men from around the world? And how many of the airfields built for the BCAP, now abandoned or used as small municipal airports, still hold forgotten stories of the young men who trained there? Number 11. How did a highway built in 8 months change a continent? In the nervous months after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, North America felt vulnerable. The threat of an enemy invasion of Alaska, and from there the west coast of the continent, was considered a very real possibility. The problem was that Alaska was almost completely cut off. There was no reliable, secure overland route to get troops and supplies to defend it. The solution was one of the most incredible engineering feats of the 20th century, the Alaska Highway. The decision was made in February 1942. The United States would build a military highway through Canada to connect Dawson Creek, British Columbia, with Delta Junction, Alaska, a distance of over 1,500 miles, about 2,400 kilometers. It was a project of unimaginable difficulty. The route went through a vast, unmapped wilderness of mountains, muskeg, swampy bog, and roaring rivers. There were no roads, no supply lines, and temperatures could swing from brutally hot in the summer to 60 degrees Celsius in the winter. The timeline was considered impossible. Build a pioneer road in less than a year. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was put in charge. Over 10,000 soldiers, including several segregated regiments of African-American soldiers who worked in horrific conditions, were sent north. They were joined by around 16,000 Canadian and American civilian workers. It was a frantic race against time. They worked 24 hours a day under the midnight sun of summer. They battled swarms of mosquitoes, mud that could swallow a bulldozer whole, and permafrost that would melt and turn the road into a quagmire. They built over 8,000 bridges and culverts. As described in historical accounts like the Milepost, the famous guide to the highway, it was a triumph of raw determination and brute force engineering. Against all odds, the Pioneer Road was completed in just over 8 months. On November 20th, 1942, a ribbon was cut at a place they called Soldiers' Summit on the shore of Colonial Lake in the Yukon. It was a rough, barely passable track, but it was open. It was a vital strategic link, allowing for the movement of military supplies and the construction of a chain of airfields used to ferry aircraft to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. Canada's contribution was essential. The Canadian government provided the right-of-way and waived taxes and import duties. Canadian surveyors helped map the route, and thousands of Canadian civilians worked on the project, often in the most difficult and remote sections. While the highway was an American project, it could not have happened without Canadian cooperation. After the war, the Canadian section of the highway was turned over to the Canadian government. It opened up the North in a way that had never been imagined, transforming the Yukon and northern British Columbia forever. It remains a testament to what can be achieved when two nations cooperate in the face of a common threat. But what was the true environmental cost of carving this road through a pristine wilderness with such speed? How were the local First Nations communities, whose traditional lands the highway cut through, truly impacted by this sudden invasion? And how many stories of the individual workers, especially the African American soldiers, who faced both the elements and racial discrimination, have been lost to history? Number 10. Did Canada's spies have a license to kill? The image of a spy is often one of glamour and intrigue, but the reality of wartime espionage was a dirty, dangerous business. For the agents of the Special Operations Executive SOE, the British organization dedicated to sabotage and subversion behind enemy lines, failure meant torture and a lonely death. Many of these agents received their final brutal training at Camp X in Ontario, but Canada also had its own intelligence service, one that remains little known to this day. It was called the British Security Coordination, run by the Canadian Sir William Stephenson, but within Canada there was a need for a domestic intelligence and security force. This role was largely filled by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police (RCMP). The RCMP's intelligence section was responsible for counter-espionage, surveillance of potential enemy sympathizers, and port security. They worked to prevent sabotage in factories and on the docks, a critical task given Canada's role as an arsenal and a shipping hub. One of the most sensitive operations was the interception of mail and communications. In a secret location in Ottawa, censors read thousands of letters and listened in on telephone calls, searching for any hint of espionage or information that might be useful to the enemy. This was a massive undertaking that balanced the needs of national security against the privacy of citizens. Canada also participated in the highly secret Signals Intelligence War. The Examination Unit, Canada's first civilian code-breaking agency, was established in 1941. It was housed in a large stone house on Laurier Avenue in Ottawa, the former home of Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden. Here, a small team of academics, linguists, and mathematicians worked to decrypt the coded messages of Vichy France and Japan. Their work provided vital intelligence on diplomatic and military matters. For example, the intelligence gathered from decoded Japanese signals gave the Allies crucial warning about Japanese intentions in Southeast Asia. This Canadian contribution to the global code-breaking effort is detailed in the book Canada's Secret War by Wesley Wark. The work of these Canadian intelligence officers and codebreakers was entirely secret. Their successes were never publicized and their failures were buried. They operated in a world of shadows where the lines between right and wrong were often blurred. Their contribution to the war was not measured in battles won, but in attacks prevented, conspiracies foiled, and secrets stolen. But what was the full extent of the RCMP's surveillance of Canadian citizens, and how were the lines drawn between legitimate security concerns and political persecution? How many enemy agents were successfully turned by Canadian intelligence and used as double agents? And are there still classified files in Ottawa that would completely change our understanding of Canada's secret war? Number 9. What if the key to the atomic bomb came from a Canadian lake? The story of the atomic bomb is usually associated with Los Alamos, New Mexico, and famous physicists like J. Robert Oppenheimer. It is a story of American science and industrial might. But a crucial ingredient, the raw material that fueled the entire project, came from a remote, unlikely place of mine on the shore of Great Bear Lake in Canada's Northwest Territories. In the 1930s, a mine at Port Radium was established to extract radium, a valuable element used for medical treatments and in luminous paint. A byproduct of the radium extraction was a large quantity of a black, heavy waste rock. That waste was uranium oxide. At the time, it had little commercial value, but in 1939, when scientists, including Albert Einstein, warned President Roosevelt that the German regime was likely pursuing an atomic weapon, uranium suddenly became the most strategic material in the world. The mine at Port Radium had been closed, but in 1942, the Canadian government secretly expropriated the company and reopened the mine under a new Crown corporation, Eldorado Mining and Refining. The entire operation was shrouded in secrecy. The ore was mined by local Diné people and other workers who had no idea of its ultimate purpose. They were paid, but they were not informed of the radioactive dangers of handling the material. The sacks of ore were transported by water and land on a long, arduous journey south to a refinery in Port Hope, Ontario. There it was processed into uranium oxide. This Canadian uranium was essential to the Manhattan Project. According to historical records and reports from the Department of Energy in the US, the earliest experimental reactors and the first atomic bombs were built using uranium that came almost exclusively from Canada and the Belgian Congo. Canadian scientists were also directly involved in the research. A team of British, French, and Canadian scientists established a secret laboratory in Montreal in 1942. This team later moved to the Chalk River Laboratories in Ontario, where they built the ZEEP reactor, the first nuclear reactor to operate outside of the United States. This work on nuclear fission was a major Canadian scientific contribution to the Allied war effort. The legacy of this contribution is complex and troubling. The Dene workers who mined and transported the ore were never warned about the risks of radiation exposure. The community of Deline, near the old mine, has suffered from unusually high rates of cancer for generations, a tragic consequence that the Canadian government was slow to acknowledge. The story is a stark reminder that even the most celebrated scientific achievements can have a dark and hidden human cost. Peter C. Van Wyck's book, The Highway of the Atom, traces the journey of the uranium and its devastating legacy. But how much did the Canadian government know about the health risks to the Dene workers at the time? Were alternative sources of uranium considered and rejected? And if so, why was the Port Radium mine so critical? And what other secret scientific research, unrelated to the atomic program, was conducted at Chalk River during the war? Number 8, did an indigenous language become an unbreakable code? In the heat of battle, communication is life, but radio communications are vulnerable. The enemy is always listening, trying to intercept messages and learn your plans. The solution is to use codes, but even the most complex codes can be broken with enough time and effort. The Allied forces, however, had a secret weapon: indigenous languages. The use of Navajo code talkers by the U.S. Marines in the Pacific is a famous story. But Canada had its own code talkers too, and their contributions have been largely unsung. One of the most notable was Charles Checker Tompkins, a Métis man from Grouard, Alberta. He was fluent in the Cree language. When he enlisted in the Canadian Army, his linguistic skills were quickly recognized. He was recruited into a top-secret program to use Cree as a code. Tompkins and other Cree-speaking soldiers were attached to the U.S. Army Air Forces. Their job was to transmit highly sensitive messages, troop movements, artillery coordinates, supply logistics dollar over the radio, speaking in their native language. The enemy's codebreakers were completely baffled. They could listen in all they wanted, but the sounds they heard were unintelligible. The Cree language has a complex grammatical structure and sounds that are completely alien to European or Asian languages. There were no dictionaries, no grammar books, and no outsiders who could translate it. It was a perfect, unbreakable code. The language itself was the encryption. To make it even more secure, the code talkers developed their own vocabulary for military terms. For example, since there is no Cree word for bomber, they might use the term for pregnant bird. A fighter plane might be a hummingbird. The contributions of Tompkins and other indigenous code talkers, such as the Ojibwe soldiers who also served in this role, were invaluable. They saved countless lives by allowing commanders to communicate freely and securely without fear of interception. Their work is highlighted in documentaries and through the efforts of the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, which has worked to preserve their stories. Yet for decades, their service remained classified. They returned home after the war and spoke little of what they had done, bound by oaths of secrecy. It was only in the 21st century that their vital role began to be officially recognized by the Canadian government and the public. Their story is one of incredible irony. At the very same time their languages were being used as a vital military asset, the Canadian government's policy of residential schools was actively trying to eradicate those same languages and cultures. The young men who used their cultural heritage to defend the country were part of a generation that was being systematically stripped of that heritage. But how many other indigenous languages from Canada were used as codes during the war? Were there code talkers embedded with Canadian units in the Italian or Northwest Europe campaigns? And how many of these heroes took their stories to the grave, their service to their country remaining a secret forever? Number 7. Could Canada have prevented a disastrous raid? It was one of the darkest days in Canadian military history. On August 19, 1942, a force of over 6,000 Allied soldiers, nearly 5,000 of them Canadian, launched a raid on the French port town of Dieppe. The plan was to seize the town for a short period, destroy the port facilities, gather intelligence, and then withdraw. It was supposed to be a major test of the enemy's coastal defenses. It turned into a catastrophe. The raid was a failure from the start. The landing force was met with devastating and accurate fire from well-prepared enemy positions on the cliffs overlooking the beaches. The tanks that were supposed to support the infantry got bogged down in the steep, gravelly beaches. Communications broke down. Within hours, the raid had collapsed into a brutal fight for survival. The order was given to withdraw, but for many, it was too late. The numbers are horrific. Of the 4,963 Canadians who took part, more than 3,350 became casualties, over 900 were killed, and nearly 2,000 were taken prisoner. It was the single bloodiest day for Canada in the entire war. The aftermath was a storm of grief, anger, and recrimination. Why was the raid launched? Was it poorly planned? Was the intelligence faulty? Who was to blame? For decades, the official narrative was that Dieppe, for all its horror, was a necessary sacrifice. It was argued that the lessons learned at Dieppe about the need for overwhelming naval and air support for specialized landing craft for better intelligence were crucial to the success of the D-Day landings in Normandy 2 years later. Lord Louis Mountbatten, the chief of combined operations who planned the raid, famously said, "For every man who died at Dieppe, 10 were saved on D-Day." However, many historians like David O'Keefe in his book One Day in August have challenged this view. O'Keefe presents compelling evidence based on declassified documents that the main secret objective of the Dieppe raid was not to test defenses, but to steal a new 4-rotor Enigma code machine and its associated code books from a German naval headquarters in the town. This intelligence pinch mission, if successful, would have been a massive prize for the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. According to this theory, the main Canadian infantry assault was, in effect, a massive and tragic diversion for a secret commando operation that also failed. The debate over Dieppe continues to this day. Was it a tragic but necessary dress rehearsal for D-Day, or was it a reckless gamble for an intelligence prize, a gamble in which thousands of Canadian lives were considered expendable? Whatever the ultimate reason, the raid stands as a stark and painful reminder of the terrible cost of war and the immense sacrifice of a generation of young Canadians. But what if the intelligence mission was the true goal? Does that make the catastrophic failure and loss of life even more difficult to accept? How much did the Canadian commanders who sent their men onto the beaches actually know about this secret objective? And are there still documents in British archives that hold the final, definitive truth about the Dieppe raid? Number 6. How did a fleet of tiny ships win the longest battle of the war? The Battle of the Atlantic was not a single event. It was a brutal, relentless, day-in, day-out campaign that lasted from the first day of the war to the last. It was the struggle to keep the sea lanes open between North America and Britain. Everything depended on it: food, fuel, weapons, soldiers. If the Allies lost the Battle of the Atlantic, they lost the war. And at the heart of this battle was a small, unassuming warship built in huge numbers by Canada, the corvette. At the start of the war, the Royal Canadian Navy was tiny. It had only a handful of modern warships. It was completely unprepared for the task of defending the massive convoys that would become the lifeline of the Allied effort. The solution was the corvette. Based on a whaler design, corvettes were small, cheap, and could be built quickly in the small shipyards on the Great Lakes and on both coasts. They were not fast or heavily armed. They were, in the words of one writer, seagoing sheepdogs. Their job was to escort the slow-moving merchant ships and protect them from the wolf packs of enemy U-boats. Life on a corvette was miserable. They were notoriously unstable ships, rolling and pitching violently in the heavy Atlantic swells. They were cramped, wet, and cold. The crews were mostly young, inexperienced volunteers, many of whom had never been to sea before. They had to learn the difficult and dangerous job of convoy escort on the job in the deadliest waters in the world. The early years of the battle were desperate. The U-boats, with their experienced crews and deadly torpedoes, were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. The Canadian Navy took heavy losses, but they learned. They got better equipment, like improved sonar called ASTIC and radar. They developed better tactics for hunting and destroying U-boats. The shipyards kept churning out more corvettes, frigates, and destroyers. By the end of the war, Canada had one of the largest navies in the world, with over 400 warships, the vast majority of which were dedicated to the Battle of the Atlantic. The Royal Canadian Navy escorted over 25,000 merchant ship crossings, delivering over 180 million tons of cargo to Europe. It was a staggering logistical achievement carried out under constant threat of attack. They were responsible for a huge section of the North Atlantic, the dangerous Black Pit in mid-ocean that was beyond the range of land-based air cover. The story of their struggle is brilliantly captured in novels like Nicholas Montserrat's The Cruel Sea and historical accounts like Mark Milner's North Atlantic Run. The cost was high. The RCN lost 33 ships and over 2,000 sailors, but they held the line, they won the longest and arguably most important battle of the war. But how did the inexperienced Canadian crews adapt so quickly to the complex and technical demands of anti-submarine warfare? What was the true psychological toll on the sailors who spent years in the cold, cramped, and terrifying conditions of a North Atlantic corvette? And how many near disasters and convoy battles have been forgotten, their stories lost with the ships that sank beneath the waves? Number 5. Could a Canadian invention save a pilot's life? In the high-speed, high-altitude dogfights of the Second World War, pilots were pushing the limits of both their machines and their own bodies. One of the most dangerous challenges was the effect of G-forces. In a tight turn or a steep dive, the force of acceleration would drain the blood from a pilot's head down to their feet. Their vision would narrow into a tunnel, then everything would go gray, and then black. This was a G-induced loss of consciousness, or GLOC. In the middle of a swirling dogfight, it was a death sentence. The solution to this critical problem came from a team of medical researchers in Toronto, led by Dr. Wilbur R. Franks at the Banting and Best Medical Research Institute. Franks was a cancer researcher, but he turned his attention to aviation medicine at the request of the Royal Canadian Air Force. He and his team tackled the problem of GLOC with a simple but brilliant idea. If the problem was blood being forced down into the lower body, what if you could create a suit that would squeeze the legs and abdomen during high G maneuvers, keeping the blood in the upper body and head? The first prototype of what would become the G-suit was created in 1940. It was a bizarre-looking contraption made of rubber and fabric with water-filled bladders. The idea was that the pressure of the water would counteract the G-forces. Franks tested the first suit himself. He was stitched into it, and then it was filled with water. It worked. He was able to withstand G-forces that would have made an unprotected person black out instantly. The design was refined into a practical, air-pressurized suit that pilots could wear in the cockpit. It became known as the Franks flying suit. It was the world's first effective anti-gravity suit. The technology was shared with the British and the Americans. Allied fighter pilots equipped with G-suits could now outturn and outmaneuver their opponents. They could pull tighter turns and dive steeper without blacking out, giving them a life or death advantage in combat. The contribution of Dr. Franks and his team, as documented in the annals of the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame, saved the lives of countless Allied airmen. This Canadian invention was a perfect example of the quiet scientific contributions that had a massive impact on the battlefield. It was not a weapon, but it made the men who used the weapons more effective. It was a life-saving piece of technology born in a Canadian medical lab that gave Allied pilots a critical edge in the war for control of the skies. But how was the initial highly secret research conducted, and what kind of primitive centrifuges or other devices did Franks use to test his theories? Did enemy pilots ever capture a downed Allied pilot with a G-suit and attempt to copy the technology? And how did the lessons learned from the Franks suit influence the development of later high-altitude and space suits? Number 4. How did Canada become the bank for the Allied cause? And wars are not just fought with soldiers and tanks, they are fought with money. The Second World War was the most expensive conflict in human history, and Canada's financial contribution to the Allied victory was immense, far out of proportion to the size of its economy. But Canada not only paid for its own massive war effort, but also became a critical financial lifeline for Great Britain. At the start of the war, Britain was quickly running out of money to pay for the weapons, food, and raw materials it needed to buy from overseas, especially from Canada and the United States. To solve this problem, Canada's Minister of Finance, James Lorimer Ilsley, launched one of the most successful public finance campaigns in history, the Victory Bonds program. Victory bonds were loans that ordinary Canadians made to the government. They were promoted through massive advertising campaigns with posters, radio shows, and celebrity endorsements. Slogans like "Buy Victory Bonds" were everywhere. The campaigns appealed to patriotism, but also to self-interest, as the bonds paid a modest rate of interest. The response from the Canadian public was overwhelming. In 9 separate victory loan drives, Canadians, from school children buying war savings stamps to major corporations, bought over $12 billion worth of bonds. This was an astronomical sum of money at the time, more than the government had ever imagined it could raise. This money allowed Canada to pay for its own military and industrial expansion, but it did much more than that. In 1942, the Canadian government instituted a program called the $1 billion Gift. It was exactly what it sounded like, a gift of $1 billion to Great Britain to help them pay for Canadian supplies. When that ran out, it was followed by the Mutual Aid Program, which provided billions more in goods and services to Britain and other allied nations, including the Soviet Union and China. In total, Canada provided over $3.4 billion in direct financial aid, a huge amount for a country of only 11 million people. In today's money, that would be equivalent to tens of billions of dollars. This program of financial aid was a precursor to the much larger American Lend-Lease program. Canada's generosity, as documented in economic histories of the war, was crucial in the early years when Britain stood almost alone. It kept the British war economy from collapsing and ensured that the flow of vital Canadian-made war materials never stopped. Canada effectively became the banker for the Commonwealth, a role it took on with determination and immense public support. But what was the long-term impact on the Canadian economy of taking on such a massive national debt? How did the victory bond campaigns change the relationship between the Canadian government and its citizens, creating a new sense of national collective effort? And were there secret financial agreements between Canada and Britain that have never been fully revealed? Number 3. How did flying boats across the ocean change the war? In 1940, the war in the air was hanging by a thread. Britain desperately needed more bombers and patrol aircraft, and the factories in the United States and Canada were starting to produce them. But there was a huge problem. How do you get a large multi-engine bomber from a factory in North America to an airfield in Scotland? The only way was to dismantle it, put it on a ship, send it through the U-boat infested waters of the Atlantic, and then reassemble it in Britain. It was a slow, dangerous, and inefficient process. The solution came from a group of civilian pilots led by a Canadian named Don Bennett, an expert in long-distance navigation. They proposed a radical idea: fly the planes across the Atlantic. At the time, this was considered incredibly risky. There were no established routes, no reliable weather forecasting, and no navigation aids over the vast empty ocean. A single engine failure or a navigation error would mean ditching in the freezing Atlantic with virtually no hope of rescue. Despite the risks, the plan was approved. It was called the Atlantic Ferry Organization, or ATFARO, and it was initially a civilian operation run by the Canadian Pacific Railway. The main base was in Dorval, Quebec. From there, pilots would fly the bombers like the Lockheed Hudson and later the B-24 Liberator on the first leg of their journey to Gander, Newfoundland. Gander, a tiny outpost, was transformed overnight into one of the busiest and most important airports in the world. From there, the pilots would take off for the long, perilous, nonstop flight over the ocean to Prestwick, Scotland. The first flights were made in the winter of 1940. They were a success. Soon, a steady stream of aircraft was making the journey. In 1941, the operation was taken over by the Royal Air Force and became RAF Ferry Command. It was a truly international effort. The pilots were a motley crew of Canadians, Americans who were officially neutral at the time and risked their citizenship to fly, Britons and others. They were some of the best pilots in the world, pioneers of transoceanic aviation. By the end of the war, Ferry Command had delivered over 9,000 aircraft across the Atlantic. They also ferried planes to other fronts, flying them across the South Atlantic to Africa and the Middle East. The operation was essential to the success of the Allied bombing campaign and the anti-submarine war. It delivered the tools of war directly into the hands of the air crews who needed them, saving precious time and bypassing the U-boat menace. The story of these daring pilots is told in books like Ferry Command by Don McVicar. It was a Canadian-born and Canadian-based operation that created the first aerial bridge across the Atlantic, a logistical miracle that was vital to victory. But how many planes and crews were lost to the Atlantic, their fate unknown, victims of weather or mechanical failure rather than enemy action? What new navigation and communication techniques were invented out of necessity by the pilots of Ferry Command? And did any of the civilian pilots who flew for ATFARO engage in clandestine intelligence gathering activities during their trips? Number 2, what was Canada's most tragic secret of the war? On December 8th, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces attacked the British colony of Hong Kong. Defending the colony was a small multinational garrison. Among them were 1,975 Canadian soldiers from 2 battalions, the Royal Rifles of Canada from Quebec and the Winnipeg Grenadiers from Manitoba. They were the first Canadian Army troops to see combat in the Second World War, and their story is one of tragedy and incredible endurance. The deployment of the Canadian troops to Hong Kong in late 1941 was a political decision. They were sent to reinforce the garrison as a show of solidarity with Britain, a deterrent against potential aggression. But they were not fully equipped or trained for the kind of fighting they would face. Many of the soldiers were young and inexperienced. They arrived in Hong Kong just weeks before the attack. The battle for Hong Kong was short and brutal. The Japanese forces were battle-hardened and vastly outnumbered the defenders. The Canadians fought with incredible courage, but the situation was hopeless. After just 18 days of vicious fighting, on Christmas Day, 1941, the colony surrendered. The battle was over, but for the survivors, a new and more terrible ordeal was just beginning. The nearly 1,700 Canadians who survived the battle were taken as prisoners of war. They would spend the next 3.5 years in brutal captivity, both in Hong Kong and in Japan. They were starved, beaten, and forced into slave labor in mines and shipyards. They suffered from malnutrition and diseases like diphtheria and beriberi. Medical care was almost non-existent. The conditions in the camps were horrific, a violation of every rule of war. The story of their suffering and their incredible resilience in the face of such inhumanity is powerfully told in first-hand accounts and in historical works like The Last Man, The Last Round by author Terry Kopp. Of the 1,975 Canadians who were sent to Hong Kong, over 550 never came home. Nearly 300 were killed in the battle, and another 260 died in the squalor of the prisoner of war camps. Those who did survive were broken in body but not in spirit. They returned to Canada as ghosts, their ordeal little understood by a country that was focused on the victories in Europe. The defense of Hong Kong was a catastrophic military defeat, a sacrifice that seemed to accomplish little. But the story of the soldiers who fought and endured there is one of the most poignant and important in Canadian history. But was the Canadian government fully aware of how unprepared the Hong Kong garrison was? And did they send the troops anyway for purely political reasons? What attempts, if any, were made by Allied intelligence to contact and support the Canadian prisoners during their long captivity? And why did it take so long for the stories of the Hong Kong veterans to be fully heard and for their incredible sacrifice to be properly recognized? Number 1. Did Canada give away its most valuable resources? A modern war machine runs on metal. Steel for ships and tanks, aluminum for aircraft, copper for wiring, and nickel for armor plating. Canada, with its vast mineral wealth, became the indispensable mine and smelter for the entire Allied war effort. This was perhaps Canada's most fundamental yet least celebrated contribution to the war. Without Canadian raw materials, the Allied war machine would have ground to a halt. The most critical of these materials was nickel. Nickel is a key ingredient in making high-strength steel alloys essential for armor plate, engine parts, and artillery shells. At the time, the mines in the Sudbury Basin of Ontario produced over 90% of the entire world's supply of nickel outside of the Soviet Union. The International Nickel Company Inco and Falconbridge mines in Sudbury operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to meet the insatiable demand. This single mining district in northern Ontario was one of the most strategic industrial locations in the world. Aluminum was just as important. It was the key to air power. Every bomber and fighter plane required huge amounts of lightweight, strong aluminum. But producing aluminum is an energy-intensive process. Canada, with its abundant and cheap hydroelectric power, especially in Quebec, was the ideal place to build massive aluminum smelters. The smelter in Arvida, Quebec, became the largest in the world, producing a huge percentage of the aluminum used by the Allies. The list goes on. Canada was a leading producer of copper, lead, and zinc. It supplied asbestos, a critical material for insulation in warships. Canadian forests provided the wood for everything from mosquito bombers to crates for shipping ammunition. This immense output of raw materials fueled the factories of Canada, Britain, and the United States. It was the foundation upon which the arsenal of democracy was built. The mobilization of Canada's natural resources, as detailed in economic histories of the period, was a masterpiece of industrial planning and execution. This contribution was not glamorous. It did not involve heroic battles or secret agents. It was the hard, dirty, and dangerous work of miners, smelter workers, and loggers. But it was absolutely essential. The ships that won the Battle of the Atlantic were built with Canadian steel and protected by Canadian nickel. The planes that won the air war over Europe were built with Canadian aluminum. Canada was the resource powerhouse that quietly and reliably supplied the building blocks of victory. But at what environmental cost did this massive and rapid expansion of mining and smelting come? What was the human cost for the workers in these dangerous industries who faced few safety regulations? And how did the wartime demand for these resources permanently shape the Canadian economy, locking it into a role as a resource supplier for the world for decades to come?